Hi Rebels, I'm Layla, and together with Rebel Girls, we're celebrating Black History Month. Today, we're shining a spotlight on 5 phenomenal women whose courage, talent, and determination shaped the world we live in today. Get ready to meet Madam C.J. Walker, the first self-made woman millionaire and a champion for women's empowerment, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the incredible musician whose sound laid the foundation for rock and roll, Rosa Parks, the fearless civil rights activist who took a stand by staying seated, Maya Angelou, the powerful poet, author, and activist who inspired generations with her words, and Flojo, the record-breaking Olympic sprinter whose speed and style wowed the world. From science to sports, activism to art, these women weren't just part of history, they made it. First up is our story about Madam C.J. Walker.
Once upon a time, on a cotton plantation in Louisiana, a girl named Sarah was born. Sarah came into the world in a one-room cabin at the edge of the plantation's cotton fields. Her family lived in Delta, a tiny town nestled in a sharp curve of the Mississippi River. There's no evidence of Sarah's birth. There's no certificate or census record. But this little girl would grow into a woman who made sure the world knew her name. Sarah Breedlove was the first in her family to be born free. Her parents and her 4 older siblings were all born into slavery. But just 2 years before Sarah was born, the Civil War ended and slavery was finally abolished. Now, the Breedlove family was free, but that didn't mean life was easy. They still made their living growing and picking cotton. And they didn't own the land they farmed on, so they had to share their small income with the man who did. They worked long hours in the blistering Louisiana heat, and taking time off was not an option. So when Sarah was a baby, her mother would strap her to her back and take Sarah into the fields with her. And as soon as she was 4 years old, Sarah went to work alongside her parents in the fields. She crouched down to make holes in a long line and drop cotton seeds in each one, the sun beating down on her tiny back. Just a few years later, she was doing the same work as the grown-ups. Sarah and her friend Celeste bragged that they could chop and pick cotton clean faster than anyone else. Because the sooner they were done, the sooner they could slip away to catch crawfish in the bayou, where long moss swayed in the trees above. On the weekends, the Breedloves would get together with other families for rowdy fish fries and picnic outings. And every Sunday, the girls would sit next to each other on the long wooden pews at church with matching hairstyles, their hair worked into tight twists and wrapped with string. But when Sarah was 7, everything changed. Her mother died. And soon her father was out of the picture too. Whether he died or just skipped town, we can't say for sure. Suddenly, Sarah was an orphan, and she had to fend for herself. I'm Purna Jagannathan, and this is Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, a fairy tale podcast about the extraordinary women who inspire us. This week, Madam C.J. Walker. With no parents to care for her, Sarah depended entirely on her siblings. She went to live with her older sister Lavinia, who was married to a man named Jesse Powell. But Sarah didn't find a loving home with them. Jesse was a cruel man. To him, Sarah was just another mouth to feed, and he expected her to earn her keep. So when Sarah turned 10, she started working as a laundress. She spent her days in the homes of strangers, washing laundry by hand in big wooden tubs. She spent hours elbow deep in hot water, using harsh soaps that left her skin raw and irritated. It was such back-breaking work that people with any money at all simply refused to do it. Sarah, on the other hand, had no choice. If she hadn't been born in a place where racism and cruelty were the norm, she would have been in the 4th grade by now, learning multiplication tables and state capitals by heart, and maybe discovering the joy of a good book. But there was little time for fun in Sarah's life now. When she got home at night, it was all she could do to get ready for bed. She'd fall asleep as soon as she closed her eyes. By the time Sarah was 14, she was desperate to escape. She wanted a home of her own. She wanted to go to school and travel to Paris and see famous artwork and listen to the music of great orchestras in Carnegie Hall. Sarah promised herself that her dreams would not sink in a wooden washtub. So she found a way out. She ran away with a man named Moses McWilliams, and though Moses would soon leave her a widow, he left her something else too, a daughter. Sarah gave birth to Lelia when she was just 17. Sarah loved Lelia, and she wanted her to go to school and learn all the things that she'd missed out on. So she decided to move her tiny family, just her and Lelia, to St. Louis, Missouri. There, she could be closer to her 3 older brothers who were making good money as barbers. Sarah had no trouble finding work as a laundress in St. Louis. And even though she struggled to make more than $1.50 a day, it was enough to cover rent. Sarah and Lelia's new home was a tiny apartment, just a room, really, in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. But it was theirs. Lelia was going to school, and Sarah started taking night classes. They were getting by. But in quiet moments, when she was alone, Sarah worried about the future. She started dating a man named Charles J. Walker, CJ for short. And even though he was a newspaper ad salesman, he was far from being rich. They planned on getting married soon, but Sarah didn't see how this would change much for her. One morning, Sarah sat bent over her washboard with a huge load of laundry in the tub in front of her. She stared down at her arms, buried in soap suds, and she asked herself, "What are you going to do when you grow old and your back gets stiff? Who's going to take care of your little girl?" She couldn't see how she, a poor washerwoman, was going to make a better life for herself or her daughter. But soon, everything would change. Not long after moving to St. Louis, Sarah started to notice something weird. Strands of her hair were everywhere. Her pillow, her dresses, her kitchen table. She was losing hair at an alarming rate. Now, this wasn't an unusual problem at the time, especially for women as poor as Sarah. Most of them didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing, so taking baths was a special occasion. Being stressed and not having enough to eat only made things worse. She loved her thick black hair, and she was desperate for a way to keep it. Fortunately, there was a woman in St. Louis named Annie Turnbow Malone who sold hair products for women with the same problems as Sarah. She tried Annie's products, and they worked. In fact, they worked so well that Sarah took a job as a saleswoman for the company. She learned how to treat women's hair with shampoos, scalp massages, and special brushes. Little did Annie know that Sarah was about to become her biggest rival. Because Sarah had decided it was time to go into business for herself. One night, she knelt at the side of the rickety bed she shared with Lilia, and she prayed. As Sarah tells it, her prayer was answered with a dream. While she slept, she says, a black man came to her and told her exactly which ingredients to mix together to heal scalps and grow hair, even better than Turnbow's products could. Sarah woke up the next day and set out to find all the ingredients she dreamt of. She combined them in her kitchen and rubbed the mixture into her scalp. In a few weeks, she says her hair was coming in faster than it had ever fallen out. Soon, Sarah's friends wanted to try too, and her elixir worked just as well for them. For a moment, Sarah glimpsed a different future, one that didn't involve washboards and soap suds and backaches. And she didn't think twice. Sarah rented out a tiny attic so she had enough space to mix tubs of her own hair-growing formula. And she started advertising in local papers. A reporter for the Kansas City Star later wrote that she spent money on advertising as fast as she earned it, spending more on printer's ink in the beginning than she spent on bread and butter. And it was working, because there were many African American women like Sarah, desperate for hair products designed specifically for them. Sarah's ads ran in newspapers for some 6 months straight, and then they stopped. Suddenly, there wasn't a single line from Sarah in the local newspapers. She'd gone radio silent. But after a few months, a new ad appeared. This one was for Madam C.J. Walker. Sarah was rebranding. She had finally married C.J. Walker, so she took his name. And her new title, Madam, was a nod to the French beauty industry and the sophistication she wanted to recreate for African American women in the U.S. Before long, Sarah's hair grower was selling so well that she decided it was time to hit the road and take her products to other cities. Her new husband and friends told her she was jumping in too quickly. They couldn't see how she'd be able to cover her expenses to get from one town to another. Luckily, she didn't listen. She set off with suitcases full of her new product, Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. She crisscrossed the country by train, making contacts and finding new customers in every city she visited. Madam's demonstrations were convincing, and many of the women she spoke to placed orders to get their own bottles of hair grower. Back at home, Lilia received the orders, ran to the post office, and mailed the products to women all over the country. Their customers were more than satisfied, because Madam wasn't trying to make them look like the beauty icons of the day, white women with straight, wispy hair. She wanted to make their hair look beautiful in the way that only black hair could. Many of Madam C.J. Walker's customers were using hair products made specifically for their hair for the first time in their lives. A woman from Helena, Arkansas, wrote Madam to tell her that she was a godsend to humanity. Another woman from Dallas, Texas, wrote to say, "My hair is a talk of the town. I have to take it down to let people see and feel it for themselves." Soon, they were getting so many orders that they could not keep up. Madam's little startup was turning into a real company. She started hiring sales agents in cities across the country. Their numbers were growing every day. At the same time, Madam's relationship with her husband was becoming strained. He was unfaithful, and now that the business was booming, they fought about how to handle it. Madam had always been in charge, and she intended to keep it that way. When she bought a brick building in Indiana to be her factory, laboratory, and salon, it had just one name on it: hers. Before long, they parted ways for good. But Madam decided to keep the name C.J. Walker. Because of her, it had become famous. Just 5 years after she'd struck out on her own, Madam had customers and sales agents in nearly every state. And Madam had become rich. Even though she loved nice clothes and art and fancy cars, she had bigger plans for her money. She wanted to help people in her community, Black people who were struggling to get by like she had. After all, it wasn't long ago that she had washed laundry and picked cotton. And even though slavery was over, a lot of things had stayed exactly the same. Almost every day in the newspapers, there were stories of horrible violence against Black men and women. In 1915, 69 African Americans were lynched across the country. Madam wanted to do something about it. Her business advisors and friends told her that politics and business don't mix, that it was risky to get involved in these matters. But again, Madam didn't listen. She donated to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund and even went to Washington, D.C. with a group of other Black activists to tell President Wilson that lynchings had to be stopped. She was so outspoken about what was going wrong in the country that the government added her to a list of what they called Negro subversives and kept her under surveillance. But she got involved in smaller causes too. She donated money to churches, to schools, to community centers, and she wanted her sales agents, now numbering in the thousands, to follow her lead. So she started an annual conference where the women could get together and talk about their work. Madam awarded prizes, not just to the agents with the highest sales, but also to those who had raised the most money for charities. By 1915, Madam's annual sales were over $100,000. That's around $2 million in today's dollars. And even though she had everything she could possibly want, what she really loved was running her company. In October 1917, she was on a business trip to the South when she made a stop in Vicksburg, the city where she'd worked her first job as a laundress at the age of 10. Just across the river from Delta, where she was born. Her old church in Vicksburg had invited her back to give a lecture, and she agreed. She stood at the pulpit and looked out at the congregation. It was a full house. Everyone crowded into the same hard pews she had sat on 40 years ago. She told them how she'd worked her way from being a poor laundress to being a powerful entrepreneur and activist. They hung on every word. She was the first woman, Black or white, to become a self-made millionaire in the history of the country.
Madam C.J. Walker's journey is nothing short of inspiring. From revolutionizing hair care and breaking barriers as a self-made millionaire, let's fast forward to the early 20th century. The music world was about to be rocked, literally, by a trailblazer with a guitar. Meet Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the godmother of rock and roll.
Once upon a time, there was a girl with a song in her heart. Her name was Rosetta. 4-year-old Rosetta, or as her family and friends called her, Rosietta, scampered down a dirt road. She followed her mother past a few shops and businesses until they reached the Cotton Plant, Arkansas's Church of God in Christ Church, and settled into a creaky pew with her mother, Katie. "Rosietta, don't fidget," Katie whispered, adjusting her hat. "You'll do great." Church was one of Rosie's favorite times of the week. The entire community gathered at church to sing, dance, stomp, and shout their joy to the rafters so loud that God and the angels could hear. When it was her turn, Rosie slid out of the pew and walked to the front. Rosie grinned when one of the musicians handed her a big guitar. It was so heavy she almost couldn't carry it. But her fingers and her voice knew just what to do. She took a deep breath and sang as loud as she could. Soon, Rosie would grow up to be an international gospel star who rocked out on the electric guitar. I'm Kateri Bluford, and this is Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, a fairy tale podcast about the rebel women who inspire us. On this episode, Rosetta Tharpe, the godmother of rock and roll, who knew how to shred on any guitar and inspired every rock star who came after her. Rosetta sat on a train, staring glumly out the window. There was nothing she wanted more than to go back home to the small town she knew. But her mother had decided to pack up a few bags and take her daughter to Chicago. Rosie missed her father. She didn't know it yet, but she would never see him again. In Chicago, though, they joined an even bigger church. Rosie almost forgot how sad she was when the band burst out with its loud, happy music and upbeat instrumental music. Churchgoers slapped tambourines against their legs, and musicians played piano, drums, and trumpets. It felt like a huge party every week. The church community felt just like home. There was just one thing missing. Rosetta wanted to put on a show. Katie introduced her daughter as a singing and guitar-playing miracle. Everyone was curious about the little girl and wanted to see what she could do. One Sunday, the pastor lifted Rosie up on the piano so that everybody could see her. Then he handed her a too-big guitar. The moment she opened her mouth and let out her big voice, it was clear Rosetta was special. She felt every song deep in her heart. Her hands danced across the guitar strings, and her voice went up and down, loud and soft. She added extra words and a little extra Rosie flair. Soon, Katie and Rosetta took their show on the road. They were invited to play at church meetings, services, and several-day church revival services in big tents all over the Midwest and beyond. On one of these trips, Rosie met a young preacher, Thomas Tharpe. At 19, Rosie got married and joined his church. On Sundays, he preached and she played her famous guitar. But people were there more for her than for her husband. She shone much brighter than him, and he didn't like that. He tried to control her, and she started getting tired of it. Even though they had their problems, she got up every Sunday morning to sing. It was the last straw when he found another woman he liked better. Despite how much she loved him, he had hurt her too much. Rosetta left mean old preacher Thomas and took her talents to New York City. In New York, she could reinvent herself. Instead of performing in churches, she decided she would branch out to non-religious venues. She kept the name Tharpe and started going by Rosetta instead of Rosietta like when she was a kid. Rosetta Tharpe found a job singing in the famous Cotton Club that hosted singers, dancers, actors, and comedians from all over. Although the club was usually whites only, they made exceptions for black artists. The sign outside the club read, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. When she got inside, it was nothing like what she was used to. Everyone was white, and most of the performers were wild colors and sequins. She felt out of place in her modest dress, but she brought her bright smile and her heartfelt songs. She held her guitar like a trusted old friend and cheerfully faced the crowd to belt out a song. She made them feel the song all the way down to their bones. Sister Rosetta Tharpe's fame grew and grew. She recorded her songs and her music was snatched up from the stores like hotcakes. Record companies sent Rosetta's songs abroad to entertain soldiers during World War II. She performed at the famous black nightclub Cafe Society at Carnegie Hall as an honored guest and all across America. That girl could play that guitar, fans said. Lord have mercy. She would make it talk, made that guitar walk and talk. Another audience member chimed in. Go on, girl. Make it talk, Rosetta. Most people love Rosetta, but not everyone did. There were debates about whether her music was religious enough for church. Some folks liked her new style of non-religious music, but some people wanted her to be more traditionally spiritual and only sing about how much she loved God. Some folks wanted her to be a modest, quiet, feminine woman. Rosetta's mean old ex-husband even came to one of her shows to yell at her for not being modest enough during her concerts. Cover your head, Thomas said, chastising her for not wearing a hat. Rosetta ignored him. She had enough rules at home as it was, from her mother Katie, who now went by the name Mother Bell. Mother Bell wanted to make sure her daughter followed their strict religious principles. There were a lot of no's. No non-church music on Sundays, no record player in the house, no dancing, no showing your bare legs or arms. Rosetta followed most of these rules, but she and her friend Roxy liked to dance. They would pull out the radio and dance around the apartment where nobody could see. Girls, you all ought to be ashamed of yourselves, said Mother Bell. Ma Bell, you don't understand, the young women protested. Yes, I do, Mother Bell huffed. Rosetta and Roxy just grinned at each other. They followed most of the rules, but they knew which ones could be bent. One day, Rosetta heard a voice that she felt would harmonize perfectly with her own. The voice belonged to a woman named Marie Knight, a slender, elegant lady with bright, shining eyes. Her talented fingers danced across the white piano keys with grace. A plan started to form in Rosetta's mind. Maybe Marie would want to travel with her group of gospel musicians. Rosetta begged her to join. Even though Marie had 2 small children, she left them in the capable hands of their grandmother and agreed. The very next day, Rosetta and Marie took a train to the Midwest to perform in Chicago and Detroit as Sister Rosetta Tharpe featuring special guest Madame Marie Knight. Marie and Rosetta wore fancy white dresses, sparkly earrings, and fur coats. Their stylists did their hair and makeup. When they stepped out from behind the curtain, Marie and Rosetta's smiles shone almost as bright as the stage lights. People loved seeing the two of them together. They'd wear silly costumes and crack jokes during the show. They'd switch instruments and take turns singing or playing solo. Some people thought they were in love with each other because Rosetta loved both men and women. But Marie insisted that they were just best friends, and Rosetta kept the details of her private life quiet. But then Marie's family suffered a terrible tragedy. So she stopped traveling with Rosetta and headed home to New Jersey to be with her family. Even though their tour was over, the two stayed friends for their whole lives. Rosetta's biggest concert ever was also her wedding. With joyful, carnival-like flair, signs everywhere read, "Wedding bells ring out for Rosetta Tharpe. Witness the most elaborate wedding ever staged. Everybody welcome, plus world's greatest spiritual concert." In 1951, Rosetta stepped onto the stage wearing an outfit that was roughly the price of a brand new car during that year. A rhinestone and pearl-encrusted tiara rested among her curls. Her sequin-trimmed veil trailed behind her as her white satin heels clicked across the stage. The wedding was lavish and expensive, but the concert was the main event. Rosetta and dozens of her famous musical artist friends performed for 20,000 guests. At the end of the show, fireworks lit up in the night sky with images of a giant Rosetta playing guitar. She wanted to go out with a bang. After her wedding, Rosetta kept performing for audiences all over America, but she wanted to try something new. She switched from acoustic guitar to electric and experimented with the new sound. She wailed and pranced around the stage, blending jazz, blues, and gospel sounds together to create a whole new genre. Then she brought her unique sound to Europe. She performed in Britain, France, Switzerland, Denmark, and Sweden. The people there didn't know much about Black people, but they were sure excited to hear her play. You know, there is nothing like a friendly, warm audience, Rosetta told reporters. As Rosetta got older, she started to feel sicker and sicker. Her music wasn't as popular as it was before her lavish wedding concert. But she went on traveling and playing music until she couldn't anymore. She had music in her bones. Rosetta's music influenced hundreds of famous rock star legends. But Rosetta was possibly the first rock star. It's said that her song "Strange Things Happen Every Day" was the first rock song ever produced. When she heard about a new name for a genre of music, she laughed and said, "All this new stuff they call rock and roll, why? I've been playing that for years." Rosetta passed away in 1973. Marie Knight prepared Rosetta's clothes and makeup for the funeral as a final gesture of their strong friendship. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. People now call Sister Rosetta Tharpe the godmother of rock and roll.
I love that story. Now, while Rosetta was changing the sound of music, another courageous woman was getting ready to change the course of history. Let's hop on a bus and travel to Montgomery, Alabama, where Rosa Parks made her legendary stand for civil rights.
Once upon a time, there was a girl who, with quiet courage, challenged injustice and changed the world. Her name was Rosa. Rosa was born in Alabama in 1913, and when she was young, she and her younger brother Sylvester walked to school every day. Big yellow school buses often rolled past, kicking up dust. But the school buses weren't for Rosa or Sylvester. Rosa and her brother were Black, and the buses were only for white kids. Sometimes the white kids shouted mean names at them. Other times, those kids even threw trash at them. At that time in the South, there were laws that said Black people couldn't go to the same schools as white people. They also couldn't eat at the same restaurants, swim in public pools together, or even drink from the same water fountains. Rosa thought this was unfair. She was just as good as anyone else. Why should she and her family be treated any differently? One day, Rosa told herself, things will be different. She may not have known it then, but as a grown-up, she would help start a revolution. I'm Professor Anita Hill, and this is Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, a fairy tale podcast about the rebel women who inspire us. On this episode, Rosa Parks, a champion of civil rights, courageous advocate and organizer, and a woman who refused to give up. When Rosa was little, she lived with her mother and grandparents on a farm in Pine Level, Alabama. Rosa loved playing hide and seek with her brother and fishing in nearby ponds. She even liked helping with the chores. But beyond the safety of the family farm, the world seemed really scary. Many white people in Pine Level belonged to a group called the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. The KKK wore white robes and hoods. They burned down black churches, set fire to houses, and even hurt and killed black people just because they were black. Rosa's grandfather had been enslaved, and he would not be intimidated by these white men. If the KKK rode past their home, he would sit on the front porch with a shotgun. Rosa often sat beside him. Rosa was afraid, of course, but like her grandfather, she would not let fear stop her from standing up for herself. As Rosa grew and went to school, she decided she wanted to be a nurse or a social worker. But achieving that dream in Pine Level was difficult. In Alabama, public schools for black kids stopped at 6th grade. So when Rosa was 11, her mother sent her to live with relatives in Montgomery, Alabama, to go to a special school where she could keep on learning. And the more Rosa learned, the more she saw her dreams coming into focus. But there were people out there who wanted to crush those dreams. First, white people set fire to Rosa's school twice. They didn't think black girls should be educated. And in 1928, when she was 15, the school was forced to close. A year or so later, Rosa had to leave school altogether to help her family back in Pine Level. Rosa's dreams of finishing high school and college vanished. After moving home, Rosa got a job cleaning houses. And then one day, when she was 18 years old, a friend introduced her to a young man named Raymond. Raymond loved to read and had a lot of big ideas about justice and equality. And he often worked with his fellow black community members to advocate for change. Rosa thought he was very smart and brave. In 1932, they got married and moved back to Montgomery. Raymond encouraged Rosa to go back to school, and in 1934, she graduated with a high school diploma. Rosa was proud of her accomplishments, But job opportunities for Black women were still limited. So she worked as a nurse's assistant, a secretary, and later, a seamstress. Rosa had often watched Raymond working to bring fairness to Black communities. Sometimes she feared for Raymond's life, but despite these dangers, Rosa decided she wanted to help too. In 1943, Rosa joined the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. When she walked into her first meeting, Rosa was the only woman. And because most secretaries at the time were women, they asked her to take notes. That day, Rosa was elected chapter secretary, a role she held for 12 years. In her new position, Rosa shared news about hate crimes committed against Black people. She helped women who had been the victims of violence, and she helped Black people register or sign up to vote. Soon, she was leading a youth council for the NAACP in Montgomery. And later, she went to Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. This was a special school for adults to learn about social justice and about community organizing. There, white people and Black people roomed together, cooked together, ate together, and did chores together, acts that were forbidden across the South. At the end of Rosa's training, the teachers encouraged students to share what changes they could make in their own communities. When it was Rosa's turn, she sighed. She told the group she didn't think much could change in Montgomery. But Rosa promised to keep working with young people. They were their best hope for change, she said. A few months later, on December 1st, 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks boarded her bus as usual after work. In Montgomery, buses were segregated. White people sat in the front and Black people sat in the back. The middle of the bus was a neutral zone, but each row had to be all Black or all white. Rosa sat in the bus's neutral zone in a row with 3 other Black passengers. She was thinking about the workshop she would be holding for youth activists that weekend, and about dinner that night. Raymond was cooking a pot roast. Her taste buds tingled just thinking about it. Suddenly, she heard a gruff voice from the front of the bus. "Move, y'all," the white bus driver said. "I want those 2 seats." The other passengers on Rosa's row stood and moved to the back of the bus. But Rosa didn't budge. She thought of her grandfather on the porch with his rifle. She thought of Claudette Colvin, too. She was a teenager from her youth council who had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus just a few months before. Rosa was tired. She was tired of stepping off the sidewalk for white people and drinking from different water fountains. She was tired of being mistreated, tired of giving in. Soon, the driver's reddened face hovered near Rosa's. "Are you going to stand up?" he said angrily. "No," Rosa said with quiet calm. Rosa was scared, but she imagined her ancestors surrounding her, and all of those who stood up for the rights of Black people before. "Well, I'm going to have you arrested," the driver said. "You may do that," Rosa answered. Soon, the red and blue lights of a police car flashed through the bus's window. Policemen escorted her off the bus and took her to jail. Mrs. Parks' friends from the NAACP posted her bail. As soon as they got her home and knew she was safe, they started making plans. Maybe they could use her court case to challenge these segregation laws. Rosa and her family were hesitant at first, but they knew this was important. And our fellow leaders at the NAACP had been looking for a court case to challenge Montgomery's discriminatory bus laws. So even though she was afraid, Rosa agreed. Just a few days after Mrs. Parks' arrest, something else happened. A group of women led by Joanne Robinson, the head of a Black women's organization in Montgomery, had gotten together to call for a boycott of Montgomery's bus system. They plastered the city with flyers. Mrs. Parks was not the first Black person in Montgomery to refuse to give up her seat on a bus. That year alone, at least 2 other women had gone to jail for it. But there was something different this time. Black residents of Montgomery respected her, and they were fed up too. On Monday, December 5th, Black people of all ages could be found walking Montgomery's streets. Empty buses rumbled by. People chanted after them, "No riders today." That night, thousands of Black community members gathered at the church of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a new minister in town. There they made a decision. The boycott would continue until Black people were treated as equals on the bus. People with cars organized carpools and gave free rides. Soon, communities around the country heard about the boycott. They sent shoes and money to help the cause. But the boycott made a lot of white people mad. Rosa and her family received death threats. Dr. King's house was bombed. Black community members' cars were vandalized. On top of that, Rosa and Raymond both lost their jobs. It was dangerous work. It was hard on their souls. But they refused to give up. The bus boycott lasted for more than 1 year. Eventually, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, ruled that segregation on Montgomery's buses was illegal. On December 21, 1956, buses in Montgomery were officially desegregated. Black residents streamed onto the buses and sat wherever they wanted. Reporters followed Mrs. Parks as she boarded her first bus after the boycott ended. To her surprise, the bus driver was the same one who had had her arrested before. But she just went ahead and took her place in the front seat. And as the bus pulled away from the curb, she looked out the window, watching the streets of Montgomery slowly roll by. The Montgomery bus boycott inspired protests and acts of resistance across the country and supercharged the civil rights movement in the United States. Some people even call Mrs. Parks the mother of the civil rights movement. Rosa was overjoyed, but their victory had a cost. Rosa and Raymond still couldn't find jobs, and they suffered health problems from all the stress. And even though the boycott was over, the threatening letters and calls didn't stop. Eventually, they decided to leave Montgomery, and in 1957, they moved to Detroit, Michigan. In Detroit, Mrs. Parks kept protesting, speaking out against injustice, and working for equal rights, especially for people of color and for women. Eventually, in 1965, she got a job with John Conyers, a Black U.S. congressman from Michigan. She worked there for more than 20 years. As the years went on, Mrs. Parks received awards and honors from around the globe. In 1996, President Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And in 1999, she received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor given by the U.S. legislature. When Rosa died in 2005 at age 92, her coffin was brought to the U.S. Capitol building so people could pay their respects. She was the first woman and second Black person ever to receive such an honor. Throughout her life, Mrs. Rosa Parks faced many challenges, but in the face of fear and danger, she always stood up for what was right, even if it meant staying in her seat. Someday, when you see someone treated unfairly, you can think of Mrs. Parks. Imagine her right beside you. See her courage and strength surrounding you and flowing through you. Listen to her saying, "You must never be fearful about what you are doing when it is right." And filled with her courage, perhaps you can be brave enough to stand up or sit down, too.
Rosa Parks showed us that an act of courage can change the world. She inspired a movement, and her bravery echoed in the hearts of many, including a young woman named Maya Angelou. Let's turn the page to Maya's incredible story, a poet, author, and activist whose words move the world.
It's time to rest again, rebels. To let the day go. To let your mind wander into a world of ideas and dreams and poetry. We're going to hear the story of a woman whose name was Marguerite Annie Johnson. But most people knew her as Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou used her voice to recite beautiful verses and to stand up for herself. Before we get started, let's get settled in. Snuggle down. Close your eyes and begin to imagine. Let your mind go on a bedtime journey. When Maya Angelou was a young girl, she was afraid to speak. In fact, there was a period of time where she didn't speak for 5 years. But as she grew, she learned how to use her voice. She used that voice of hers to write volumes of stories and poems and recite them in front of thousands of people. But before she was a famous poet, she was a 16-year-old girl who wanted to be a streetcar conductor. Let's begin to imagine a soft, dawning light over a city just starting to wake up. In the early, gentle light, Maya was already up and reading. Maya loved to read, and as a young girl, she would read big stories. Stories that transported her. Stories that taught her things. Maya also spent much of her childhood in silence, silently memorizing everything, like the sensation of the ground on her bare feet, the tone of voices in her family, the full names of people she'd only met briefly. But she never uttered a word. Then, when she was 13 years old, Maya's teacher, Miss Flower, introduced her to poetry. She encouraged Maya to recite the poems aloud, to give them life, and Maya blossomed. She found her voice, and when she spoke, it was almost like she could speak directly into your heart. Maya lived in the hilly city of San Francisco and loved to travel across town on the streetcar. On cool mornings, clouds covered the city like a cozy blanket. Maya and her mother would wrap themselves in warm coats and scarves and board streetcar 798. She memorized the car's deep green panels, the cherry red windows chipped in the corners, and the single bright headlight in the front to guide the driver through the dense fog. Maya loved everything about the streetcar, but most of all, the conductors. She loved their dark blue fitted uniforms, smart little hats tilted to the side, and changer belts with the coin dispensers. 10 cents to ride, a conductor would say. A passenger would toss the conductor a quarter, and she'd pop back a nickel and a dime faster than they could draw back their hand. Maya thought it was like magic. She pictured herself in the sharp blue suit, tossing coins back and forth to the passengers, riding the rails with the wind looping through her hair. And one day she decided she wanted to work as a streetcar conductor, and she knew just how to make it happen. Just like that, 16-year-old Maya strolled right into the offices of Market Street Railway and said, "I would like to apply for the position of streetcar conductor." And they said, "No," and laughed at her. They wouldn't even give her an application. Maya was devastated. When she got home, she told her mother what happened. "Do you know why they wouldn't give you the job?" "Yes," said Maya. "Because I'm a Negro," which is what they called black people in those days. Then her mother said, "If you want that job, you go and get it." And she gave her very specific instructions. She told her to go back to that office with her biggest books and sit and read and sit until they changed their minds. And that's just what she did. Maya went back to the office and sat silently, reading her book in the lobby all morning. At lunchtime, she watched the secretaries scurry out of the office in one direction and the businessmen scuffle out in the other direction. Maya followed the businessmen. She followed them into a diner. They ordered a sandwich. So did she. They ordered coffee. So did she. When lunchtime was over, she followed them back into the office and sat in the lobby and read silently. Maya did this for 14 days. On the 14th day, Maya was in the middle of an old and worn book when she heard a voice say, "Miss." Maya looked up and saw a man standing in front of her. "What do you want?" he asked her. Maya closed her book, stood up, and spoke. "I want to be a streetcar conductor." "Why?" he asked. "Because I love the uniforms," she answered, "and I love people." And perhaps he saw in her eyes that it was more than that. Because, as simple as her request was, she had been diligent and patient to get what she wanted. And because she knew in her young heart that she deserved to be a streetcar conductor as much as anyone else. Maya got the job. And legend has it that in that moment, Maya Angelou became the first black woman ever to become a streetcar conductor in San Francisco. So, at 4 a.m. every morning, before the sunrise, Maya would slip into the bath that her mother had drawn for her. Slip into her firmly pressed blue uniform and slip out the door down to East Bay Terminal at 1st Street and Mission to begin her route as a conductor. Maya's streetcar would travel down Market Street to Haight Street and wind along Lincoln Way to reach the beach, then cross Golden Gate Park. Along the way, passengers would board the streetcar, and Maya would read their faces and wonder where they were headed. She would shine her brightest smile and say, "Welcome, 10 cents to ride." And Maya was proud because she knew as long as she used her voice, she could go anywhere. Maya would sway back and forth at the rear of the trolley, waiting for the sun to rise. She'd read the sounds of the streetcar and memorized the clinks and clanks it would make when it was turning a corner or going up a steep hill. She'd read the curves of the hills, the colors of the flowers, the steam from the buildings, and the fog over the bay as it swirled and guided the water out into the ocean.
Maya's words taught us to soar, but now it's time to race towards the finish line. Meet Florence Griffith Joyner, or Flojo, the fastest woman in the world who's spinning her way into history with style and grace.
It was a hot summer morning at the 1988 Olympic Stadium in Seoul, South Korea, and all eyes were on the running track. This was the women's 100 meters, the fastest race in the Olympics, and whoever won the gold medal would officially become the fastest woman in the world. Florence Griffith Joyner jogged up to her slot in lane number 3. She was decked out in her team's uniform, along with glittering bracelets, long, flowing hair, bright red lipstick, and 6-inch long fingernails painted red, white, blue, and gold. Nobody had ever seen an athlete look this glamorous at the Olympics. They'd always appear stern and neutral, but not Flojo. She believed that fashion fueled her, and she was determined to win this race with style. Flojo crouched down into her starting position. Her feet found the block behind her, and she tucked her chin to her chest. She could feel her muscles strong and taut, prepared to do what they did best. Flojo was just like a firecracker, lit and ready to explode. I'm Jordan Childs, and this is Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, a fairy tale podcast about the real-life rebel women who inspire us. On this episode, Florence Griffith Joyner, one of the fastest female runners of all time. Florence Griffith was born in Los Angeles, California, the 7th of 11 children. The Griffith household was very hectic, but they loved each other dearly and were very close. Florence was always full of energy and exciting new ideas, especially when it came to sports and fashion. She loved sewing her own clothes for her Barbie dolls and constantly tried on her mother's dresses. She did handstand competitions with her siblings and neighbors and rode to the store on a unicycle. When she played ball with her brothers in the street, Florence was fast and fierce. If she lost or got knocked down, she bounced right back up, eager to prove herself. She also dressed up for their games, wearing her good clothes and combing her hair. She didn't need to look scrappy to feel just as strong. Florence's competitive spirit led her to join the Sugar Ray Robinson Youth Foundation, where she could try out all kinds of sports: basketball, volleyball, football, and track. She liked all the sports well enough, but it was running that really ignited a flame inside her. And she was good at it. Soon, she was running track at school, thrilled to be a part of the team. Her teachers and classmates were amazed by her speed and the bright smile that always erupted when she crossed the finish line. But there was one thing that Florence couldn't stand. She hated their uniforms. She didn't understand why they had to wear such silly, drab outfits. Florence convinced her relay teammates to pair long tights with their track uniforms. She was sure it would help fuel their fires too. As Florence liked to say, dress good to look good to feel good, and feel good to run fast. Whether it was her outfits, her determination, her muscle power, or a combination of all three, Florence was soon setting school records in the long jump and sprints. And that was just the beginning. Sprinting and striding may have given Florence a great sense of freedom and power, but her life outside of running was challenging. Track and field wasn't a popular sport at the time, and resources to finance athletes' careers, especially female athletes, were still not available. Florence started college at California State University at Northridge, but soon had to drop out to work and help support her family. It took a while, but with the help of her coach, she was able to get financial aid to study at UCLA. It was here that she hoped to get professional training and guidance. But when she wasn't at the track or going to classes, Florence still had to get a job to make ends meet. This meant long nights working as a beautician, braiding hair, and doing nails. It was exhausting. When Florence was 20 years old, she was selected to go to the American Olympic trials. It was thrilling, but nerve-wracking. Florence had never competed at this level before. She gave it her all, but still placed fourth. There was little time to be disappointed, though. Florence was soon head over heels in love. At those same Olympic trials, the famous triple jumper Al Joyner saw Florence sprint. He was speechless. He had never seen a woman so fast or so beautiful. Al waited for her to finish running and then introduced himself. She was impressed with how respectful and polite he was. An established athlete himself, Al offered to coach Florence on her path to the Olympics. She was delighted to say yes and went back to UCLA smitten. For the next few years, they trained and competed as their friendship blossomed into romance. Florence graduated from UCLA with a degree in psychology and soon after won her first silver medal at the Olympics. And in 1987, when Florence and Al got married, she officially became Florence Griffith Joyner. Or, as she liked to be called, FloJo. As she trained for the greatest competition of her life, FloJo's routine became even more intense. She began every day with 90 minutes of weightlifting, then sprinted home to cook her special shrimp Creole for dinner, rushed back out for some braiding jobs, and came back home for some painting or writing before her last workout of the day. Either another run or just a set of curls on the hamstring machine that sat in the Joyner kitchen. She was improving in both the 100 and 200 meter races, her muscles propelling her around the track faster and faster. And her clothes were getting better too. At the U.S. Olympic Trials in Indianapolis on July 16, 1988, FloJo donned a purple one-legger speed suit with a turquoise patterned bikini bottom. In the quarterfinal round of the 100 meters, she demolished the competition and set a new world record of 10.49 seconds.
No one can run that fast. The heat must be doing something to the electronics,
the ABC announcer said skeptically. But FloJo could not be held back by the doubters. People were clearly stunned by her speed and strength and looking for ways to prove she was cheating or wrong. FloJo stayed calm. She knew she'd won fair and square. And just as her mother had taught her to do, FloJo treated everyone with kindness, even those who didn't believe in her. She focused all her energy into having fun and pursuing her goals. And in 1988, that goal was to take the Seoul Olympics by storm. And that brings us back to the hot summer morning at the Olympic Stadium. Crouched on the starting line, FloJo took a deep breath and tucked her head down, feeling the fire inside her start to burn brighter and brighter. Ready, set, go. All 8 runners threw themselves off the starting blocks, their bodies flying over the track. FloJo quickly pulled ahead of the group the crowd shouting and cheering her on. Halfway through the race, Flojo switched gears and accelerated so fast that everybody else lagged 5 meters behind her. She was leaving them in the dust. Realizing her huge lead, Flojo threw her arms up well before crossing the finish line, a dazzling smile spreading across her face. She knew nobody could catch her. The gold medal was hers. After that historic win, Flojo went on to win 2 more gold medals at the Seoul Olympics, one for the 200 meters and one for the 4x100 relay. Then, at the last minute, she was asked to run in the 4x400 relay, hoping to bring home a 4th gold medal. She and her team ran hard and won the silver. Sure, it wasn't the gold, but her split was the fastest in U.S. history at the time. She treasured that silver medal, maybe even more than the golds, because it symbolized the trust that her country put in her, and she loved being a part of a powerful team. Flojo announced her retirement just 5 months after those record-breaking Olympic runs. She felt like she couldn't maintain this level of fitness as well as traveling and starting a family. Plus, she wanted to pursue other careers and continue to build her legacy off the track. She designed 2 fashion lines in Japan, and fans recognized her on the street calling, "Joiner-san!" Next, she was asked to design uniforms for the American basketball team, the Pacers. Designing for big basketball-playing men stretched her creativity. How could she make their clothes unique without her favorite pinks or lace? In the end, she designed many different possibilities, and the team picked one with big yellow and white rays down the side. Her creativity led her to all kinds of exciting pursuits. She wrote children's books, made guest appearances on TV sitcoms, and signed contracts with Coca-Cola and Mitsubishi Motors. She was named co-chairwoman of the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports, and worked with inner-city children through her Flojo International Foundation. She even had a Flojo Barbie doll, complete with its own one-legger sweet suit. Flojo loved traveling the world and sharing her different passions. She looked forward to cultivating the next great record setters and never tired of being the best-dressed person in the room. Tragically, Flojo died very young of an unexpected illness. Yet, she remains a role model for so many young athletes, hoping to follow in her lightning-fast footsteps. Her speed and grace, along with her still unbeaten record, inspire people all over the globe. And when we talk about all that she accomplished, being the fastest, the strongest, the most fashionable, that's only part of the story. Flojo's spectacular smile and indomitable spirit are beyond compare. The way she faced criticism and doubt, the way she took care of her family, her body, and her soul, these are what make her a true rebel. As Flojo used to say, I believe in the impossible because no one else does.
Wow, what an inspiring journey through history. Madam C.J. Walker turned her dreams into reality. Sister Rosetta Tharpe rocked the music world. Rosa Parks stood up for justice. Maya Angelou's words changed hearts. And Flojo showed us the meaning of speed and grace. These trailblazers didn't just follow paths, they created them, paving the way for future generations, including you. Remember, Black history isn't just about the past. It's about building the future, and you're a big part of that. Keep learning, keep dreaming, and keep making history. See you next time, and stay rebel.